Normandy, June 6, 1944. 0030 hours, 5.5 hours before the main D-Day landings. High above the French countryside, British bombers flew in tight formation, their bomb bay doors open. But they weren't dropping bombs, they were releasing something far stranger. Dozens of life-size dummy parachutists, each equipped with devices that simulated gunfire and explosions. Below, German soldiers manning defensive positions heard aircraft engines overhead, then saw parachutes blossoming in the darkness. Dozens, then hundreds of them, scattered across a wide area 15 kilometers northeast of the actual drop zones where real British paratroopers would land within the hour. Hauptmann Wilhelm Richter, commanding a reserve infantry company, immediately ordered his unit to full alert. Paratroopers landing meant invasion was imminent. He dispatched 3 platoons to intercept and destroy the enemy forces before they could consolidate and begin sabotage operations. His soldiers moved cautiously through the darkness toward where they'd seen parachutes land. They spread out, weapons ready, expecting to encounter British paratroopers at any moment. In the distance, they heard what sounded like small arms fire, rifles and submachine guns crackling in short bursts. Explosions flashed in the darkness, the sounds of combat echoed across the fields. Richter's men advanced more carefully, taking cover, scanning for enemies. They found parachutes tangled in trees and scattered across fields. But no paratroopers, no equipment containers, just strange cloth and metal objects lying in the grass. Crude mannequins dressed in British paratrooper uniforms with simple mechanisms that created noise. By the time Richter realized they'd been chasing dummies, real British paratroopers had landed at their actual objectives 15 kilometers away and were already securing bridges and disrupting German communications. Richter's entire company, over 150 soldiers, had spent the critical first hours of D-Day chasing ghosts while the real invasion happened elsewhere. These dummy parachutists, officially designated paradummies but universally called Ruperts by British forces, were among the war's simplest deception weapons. They were crude, obvious fakes when examined closely and looked absurd in planning meetings. Yet they fooled German forces repeatedly throughout the war, drawing defenders away from real targets and creating confusion at critical moments. This is the story of the dumbest decoy that somehow worked every time, and how burlap, straw, and firecrackers changed the course of history's largest invasion. Let's go back to 1943. Allied planners preparing for the eventual invasion of Europe recognized that airborne operations, dropping paratroopers behind enemy lines to seize key objectives, would be critical to success. But airborne assaults had a fundamental vulnerability. Paratroopers manned dispersed across drop zones, taking time to assemble and organize before they could fight effectively. German soldiers who knew where paratroopers were landing could rush reinforcements to those locations and destroy the airborne forces before they consolidated. What the Allies needed was a way to confuse German commanders about where paratroopers were actually landing. If you could create the illusion of parachute drops at multiple locations simultaneously, German forces would have to divide their response, dispatching units to multiple sites. This would reduce the concentration of forces at the real drop zones, giving actual paratroopers time to assemble and accomplish their missions before facing serious resistance.
The concept of military deception was well established. Dummy tanks, fake radio traffic, and double agents feeding false information had all been used successfully. But creating convincing airborne deception presented unique challenges. You needed something that looked like parachuting soldiers from a distance, that could be deployed from aircraft in large numbers, and that created enough secondary evidence, sounds, lights, movement, to convince German forces they were facing real paratroopers. Station 9, in collaboration with military deception specialists, developed multiple dummy parachutist designs throughout the war. The earliest versions were simple burlap sacks filled with straw. shaped vaguely like human figures and equipped with actual parachutes. These were adequate for creating visual deception, but lacked the audio and pyrotechnic elements that would make them truly convincing. The refined version, developed for D-Day, was more sophisticated while remaining absurdly simple in execution. The dummy consisted of a crude mannequin, burlap or canvas, sewn into a roughly human shape, stuffed with straw or sand for weight, dressed in a simplified British paratrooper uniform. The parachute was real, using actual military parachutes, ensured the dummies descended at realistic speeds and created the distinctive silhouette German observers expected. The genius was in the noise-making devices attached to each dummy. Small pyrotechnic charges, essentially military-grade firecrackers, were rigged with time delay fuses. After the dummy landed, these charges would begin detonating in sequence, creating sounds that mimicked rifle and machine gun fire. Some dummies included magnesium flares that created light flashes, simulating muzzle blasts. The most elaborate versions had multiple sound devices that would fire at irregular intervals for up to an hour, creating the impression of ongoing combat. Creating effective dummy parachutists required balancing realism with practicality. The dummies had to be convincing enough to fool German observers from typical observation distances, several hundred meters, but simple enough to manufacture in large quantities at low cost. The body construction used readily available materials. Burlap sacks, canvas, or even old uniforms were sewn into roughly human shapes, head, torso, arms, legs, without detailed features. The shapes were intentionally crude because fine detail was invisible from the distances German observers would see them. Stuffing consisted of straw, sawdust, sand, or rags, whatever bulk material was available and cheap. Weight was carefully calculated. Too light, and the dummy would swing wildly during descent, creating obviously non-human movement. Too heavy, and it would fall too fast or damage the parachute. The optimal weight was approximately 15 to 20 kilograms, light enough to be manageable, but heavy enough to descend at rates similar to actual paratroopers. The uniform components were simplified versions of British paratrooper gear. A helmet, jacket, and trousers were essential for creating the correct silhouette. The clothing didn't need to be complete or detailed. German observers couldn't see fine details from a distance at night. Some dummies used actual damaged or outdated uniforms, salvaged from supply depots. Others used fabric cut and sewn to roughly resemble uniforms, painted with appropriate colors and patterns. The parachute was real. This was non-negotiable. Using actual military parachutes ensured the dummies descended at realistic speeds and created the distinctive parachute shape German forces were trained to recognize. The parachutes were typically older models, or those with minor damage that made them unsuitable for human use, but adequate for dummies. The pyrotechnic devices were the critical deception element. Each dummy carried multiple small explosive charges, typically .303 rifle blank cartridges or purpose-built pyrotechnic units. These were mounted in a metal frame attached to the dummy's torso, wired to time delay fuses that would initiate firing sequence after landing. The timing was carefully orchestrated. The fuses were set to activate between 30 seconds and 2 minutes after impact, giving the dummies time to land and settle before opening fire. Once activated, the charges would detonate in irregular sequence over 30 to 60 minutes, creating the sound pattern of sporadic combat. Bursts of firing separated by pauses, mimicking soldiers engaging targets, reloading, and resuming fire. Some advanced versions included additional deception elements, small radio transmitters broadcasting fake communications, scent generators releasing sweat-like odors that guard dogs might detect, even recordings of human voices on mechanical playback devices, though these were rare due to technical complexity and weight constraints. Manufacturing was surprisingly labor-intensive despite the crude design. Each dummy required assembly by hand, sewing the body,
stuffing it, attaching the uniform components, rigging the parachute, installing the pyrotechnic devices, and packing everything into deployment containers. Women's auxiliary services and civilian workers did much of this work, producing thousands of dummies in the months before D-Day. Production costs were negligible compared to actual military equipment. A complete dummy parachutist cost roughly equivalent to £5 sterling, the price of a good pair of boots. The real military parachute was the most expensive component, but even this was far cheaper than training and equipping an actual soldier. Storage and transport required careful handling. The pyrotechnic devices were live explosives, requiring proper safety protocols. The dummies were packed into standard parachute deployment bags marked with distinctive codes so aircrew wouldn't confuse them with actual supply drops or real parachutists. The dummy parachutists saw their largest and most famous deployment during Operation Titanic, the D-Day deception component designed to confuse German forces about Allied airborne landing zones. The operation was meticulously planned to create maximum confusion at minimum cost. Operation Titanic consisted of 4 dummy drops designated Titanic North, South, East, and West. Each drop involved hundreds of dummy parachutists released from RAF bombers over predetermined locations away from actual Allied drop zones. The timing was coordinated to occur shortly before real paratrooper drops, ensuring German forces would respond to the deception just as actual airborne assaults began. Titanic North and South targeted areas northeast of the actual British 6th Airborne Division drop zones. Approximately 500 dummy parachutists were dropped across these sectors, accompanied by small teams of real SAS soldiers whose job was to amplify the deception with additional sounds, lights, and radio transmissions. The SAS teams, typically 4 to 6 men per location, landed with the dummies and immediately began enhancing the deception. They fired weapons in multiple directions, set up recording devices playing battle sounds at high volume, ignited flares and smoke grenades, and transmitted fake radio traffic using captured German radio protocols. Their goal was creating the impression that hundreds of British paratroopers were engaged in combat across a wide area. German response was exactly what planners hoped for. Multiple infantry companies and reserve units were dispatched to the dummy drop zones, spending the crucial first hours of D-Day fighting phantoms. By the time German commanders realized the deception, real British paratroopers had secured their objectives, bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River, and were establishing defensive positions. Titanic East and West targeted areas inland from American airborne drop zones, creating similar confusion and drawing German reserves away from actual landing sites. The combined effect was strategic deception that delayed German reinforcement responses for hours, time that proved critical for Allied success.
The dummies themselves performed beyond expectations. German soldiers in after-action reports consistently described engaging British paratroopers in the dummy drop zones. They reported seeing parachutes, hearing gunfire, observing muzzle flashes, and taking defensive positions against threats that didn't exist. The crude dummies, obvious fakes in daylight, were convincing enough in darkness and chaos to fool experienced soldiers. Not all deceptions succeeded perfectly. Some dummy drops landed in areas where German forces were already concentrated and alert. German soldiers in these locations quickly identified the dummies as decoys, though even this created useful confusion. Were all the parachute drops dummies, or were some real? The uncertainty forced German commanders to treat every airborne report seriously, consuming intelligence resources and delaying decisive action. Previous operations had tested dummy parachutists on smaller scales. During the Sicily invasion in 1943, limited dummy drops created confusion among Italian and German defenders. The North African campaign saw experimental dummy drops that validated the concept. By D-Day, the technique was refined through experience and ready for large-scale deployment. The dummy parachutists achieved their purpose, creating confusion and misdirecting German responses, despite being crude and obvious upon close examination. Understanding why they worked requires examining both the technical execution and the psychological factors that made them convincing. The visual deception worked because of human perception limitations in combat conditions. At night, from several hundred meters away, a dummy parachutist with an actual parachute looked identical to a real paratrooper. German observers couldn't see facial features, couldn't distinguish straw stuffing from human body mass, couldn't tell the difference between actual combat equipment and simplified uniform components. The audio deception was perhaps more important than visual. The pyrotechnic devices created realistic gunfire sounds that reinforced the visual impression. When German soldiers saw parachutes and heard gunfire from those locations, their brains completed the picture. Parachutes plus gunfire equals enemy paratroopers engaging in combat. This conclusion was logical, reasonable, and wrong. The timing created additional deceptive power. The dummies landed shortly before real paratroopers, when German forces were on highest alert for airborne assault. Defenders were primed to expect paratroopers, making them more likely to interpret ambiguous information as confirming that expectation. Psychologically, they were predisposed to see what they were looking for. The scale of deployment prevented close examination. Hundreds of dummies scattered across wide areas meant German forces couldn't carefully examine each one. They had to respond to the threat as a whole, dispatching units to general areas rather than investigating individual landing sites. By the time soldiers reached locations to examine parachutes, the dummies had accomplished their purpose, drawing defenders away from real targets. German doctrine contributed to the deception's success. German military training emphasized aggressive response to airborne threats, immediately dispatching forces to destroy paratroopers before they could organize. This doctrine, generally sound, meant German commanders quickly committed reserves to areas where they believed paratroopers had landed. The commitment of forces based on initial reports created momentum that was difficult to reverse even when doubts emerged. Communication challenges amplified confusion. Initial reports from forward observers who saw parachutes and heard gunfire were transmitted up the command chain. By the time these reports reached decision-makers, they'd been filtered, interpreted, and often distorted. Commanders receiving reports of British paratroopers engaged in combat at grid reference XY had no reason to doubt their accuracy. The reports matched expected threat patterns and came from multiple sources. The SAS teams accompanying dummy drops provided human elements that elevated the deception. Real soldiers firing real weapons, transmitting radio signals, and moving through areas where dummies had landed created confirmatory evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. Even when German patrols found obvious dummies, the presence of real SAS soldiers in the same area suggested the dummies were just part of a larger real force. Post-battle German reports revealed the deception's effectiveness. Multiple units reported engaging British airborne forces in areas where only dummies had landed. Some reports estimated enemy strength at battalion level, hundreds of soldiers, based on the distribution of parachutes and intensity of gunfire. These wildly inaccurate estimates influenced German tactical decisions for hours. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate tactical confusion. Once German forces discovered they'd been deceived, it created lasting uncertainty. Were other parachute drops also dummies? Were they facing real threats or more deceptions? This uncertainty degraded confidence in intelligence reporting and slowed decision-making, exactly what Allied planners wanted. Despite overall success, dummy parachutists had significant limitations and didn't work in all circumstances. Understanding the failures provides balanced perspective on the weapon's actual effectiveness. Close examination revealed the deception immediately. Any German soldier who reached a dummy quickly recognized it as fake. The crude construction, straw stuffing, and mechanical noise devices were obviously non-human upon inspection. The dummies only worked when German forces responded from a distance based on initial observations rather than waiting to confirm through close investigation. Daylight rendered the dummies nearly useless. The deception depended on darkness and distance, obscuring details. In daylight, even from hundreds of meters away, observers could distinguish dummy characteristics that revealed them as decoys.
This limited employment to nighttime operations, constraining tactical flexibility. Weather affected deployment and effectiveness. Strong winds dispersed dummies over wider areas than planned, sometimes scattering them so broadly that the intended concentration effect was lost. Rain could extinguish pyrotechnic devices before they completed their firing sequences, eliminating the critical audio deception element. The SAS teams accompanying dummies faced extreme danger. These small groups of real soldiers operating in enemy-controlled territory with minimal support and compromised by the very noise their mission required them to create became priority targets once German forces realized the deception. Several SAS teams deployed during Operation Titanic suffered casualties or were captured. German countermeasures evolved after initial encounters. Once German forces identified dummy parachutists, they distributed information about the threat throughout their command structure. By late 1944, German units receiving reports of parachute drops were more skeptical, sometimes waiting for confirmation before committing reserves. This reduced the dummy's effectiveness in subsequent operations. The technique's limitations meant it couldn't be reused indefinitely at the same location. Once German forces in a specific area had encountered dummies, they became alert to the possibility in future operations. The element of surprise, crucial to the deception's success, was permanently lost in that theater. Cost-benefit analysis post-war revealed mixed results. The direct tactical impact was significant during D-Day. German forces were misdirected at critical moments. However, quantifying whether this made decisive differences in invasion success versus merely contributing marginally is difficult. The relatively low cost of dummy production meant even marginal benefits justified the investment, but claims that dummies saved D-Day are probably exaggerated. Some military analysts argue that dummy parachutists were less effective than credited, suggesting German confusion stemmed more from overwhelming Allied strength and the shock of massive invasion rather than from specific deception operations. This interpretation, while probably too dismissive of deception effects, correctly notes that dummies alone didn't determine outcomes. They contributed to success within larger operational contexts. After 1945, dummy parachutists largely disappeared from military arsenals, replaced by more sophisticated electronic deception technologies. However, their legacy influenced military thinking about deception and psychological operations. The Cold War saw continued interest in deception technologies, though dummy parachutists specifically were rarely used. The advent of radar and infrared detection made simple physical decoys less effective. Enemies could potentially distinguish between human-sized targets with body heat and metabolic signatures versus inert dummies. Modern deception focused on electronic warfare, radar spoofing, and information operations rather than physical decoys. Special operations forces occasionally employed similar low-technology deception techniques in limited conflicts. Reports suggest dummy parachutists or comparable decoys were used in Korea, Vietnam, and various irregular warfare contexts, though details remain classified or unconfirmed. Museums rarely display dummy parachutists, primarily because few original examples survived. The dummies were expendable by design. Left behind after use, many were destroyed by German forces, burned, or simply disintegrated from exposure. The few preserved examples reside in specialized military museums, including the Airborne Museum at Arnhem and the D-Day Museum in Portsmouth. Historical memory of Operation Titanic and dummy parachutists remains obscure compared to other D-Day elements. Popular histories focus on beach landings, heroic infantry actions, and armored advances, stories with clear human drama and visual impact. Dummy parachutists, despite tactical significance, lack the narrative appeal that captivates general audiences. Veterans of SAS teams deployed with dummies rarely discussed their missions publicly. The operations were classified for decades, and even after declassification, many veterans felt their contributions seemed trivial compared to frontline combat. Being part of a deception operation, even a successful one, lacked the visceral immediacy of direct combat that made for compelling storytelling. The dummy parachutists entered popular culture primarily through military history books focused on unconventional warfare and deception operations. Authors writing about intelligence and psychological operations highlighted them as examples of creative, low-technology solutions to complex military problems. The story's appeal lies in the juxtaposition: crude straw dummies fooling professional soldiers and affecting major military operations.
The dummy parachutist was the dumbest weapon imaginable. Literally, it was straw, burlap, firecrackers, and parachute fabric sewn together by hand, designed to fool enemies for a few hours before being abandoned or destroyed. It couldn't fight, couldn't move, couldn't adapt. It just fell from the sky, made noise, and waited to be discovered. Yet this dumb weapon fooled German forces repeatedly, contributed to D-Day success, and demonstrated that military effectiveness isn't always about sophistication, firepower, or advanced technology. Sometimes the most effective weapons are the simplest, crude enough to mass produce, obvious enough to dismiss in planning, yet functional enough to accomplish their purpose when deployed correctly. The genius of dummy parachutists wasn't in their construction. Anyone with sewing skills and basic materials could make them. The genius was in understanding human perception, exploiting cognitive biases, and recognizing that soldiers in combat conditions see what they expect to see. German forces expected paratroopers to land before invasions. When they saw parachutes and heard gunfire, they concluded paratroopers had landed. The conclusion was logical, reasonable, and wrong. Station 9's engineers created many sophisticated weapons: silent pistols, concealed radios, explosive devices of remarkable ingenuity. The dummy parachutist was perhaps their least technically sophisticated creation. Yet it worked as effectively as any, achieving strategic objectives through deception rather than destruction. For the real soldiers whose lives depended on these dummies, the paratroopers landing at actual drop zones while German forces chased phantoms, the crude straw figures were anything but dumb. They were force multipliers that bought time, reduced resistance, and increased survival chances. A burlap dummy that draws enemy forces away from your landing zone is worth more than a sophisticated weapon you don't have when surrounded. So why was this dumbest British decoy parachutist so effective at fooling German patrols? Because dumb doesn't mean ineffective. Because simplicity works when complexity fails. Because sometimes a bag of straw with firecrackers attached does exactly what a million-pound weapon system can't: makes your enemy waste time, resources, and attention fighting threats that don't exist. The Germans had superior intelligence services, better trained troops, years of combat experience, yet they were fooled repeatedly by weapons that literally couldn't think, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything except fall and make noise. That's not a testament to German stupidity. It's evidence that well-designed deception exploits universal human limitations the training and experience can't fully overcome. The dummy parachutist was dumb. But sometimes, dumb is exactly smart enough. From dummy parachutists to folding motorcycles to hidden radios, World War II weapons reveals how simple ingenuity defeated sophisticated enemies. Subscribe now for more incredible stories of unconventional weapons that changed history through creativity rather than firepower.